What up, what up, what up? Welcome back to Lockdown Universe, home of the bizarre, peculiar, and unheard of stories of UFO legend and paranormal lore. Welcome back, welcome back. Happy to be back. Hopefully, you guys are doing awesome and taking care of yourselves. So, today we're going to talk about a really interesting story of an abduction of a lieutenant who was in control of some nuclear weapons by alien forces. And this is the crazy part. Remember, I don't bring you just random abduction crap. I bring you the really, really interesting stories. This story involves this lieutenant being abducted and gone for 5 years, despite the fact that it only felt to him like he was gone a few hours. It's kind of like that movie Flight of the Navigator, released by Disney back in, like, I don't know, the late 80s. Had Pee Wee Herman as, like, the ship's navigator. If you haven't seen that movie, you should definitely see it. That movie's great. But anywho, I'll tell you about this story, and we'll see what you think about it. So, this story involves a Lieutenant Gary Anderson, who is a nuclear weapons technician in the U.S. Air Force. He started his career as a young second lieutenant and basically worked his way up through the nuclear weapons school, and he had his first assignment at McCord Air Force Base in Washington. Okay, so what's his duties? He was a supervisor, doing nuclear weapons supervising underneath the 18th Fighter Squadron, and he was supposed to supervise other nuclear technicians and maintain nuclear weapons as well that were stored at McCord Air Force Base. Now, this is the really interesting part because I thought to myself, I said, why would they abduct this guy? You know, he's just when he was abducted, they were in the nuclear weapons facility storage area, and they were working on moving around some nuclear weapons. And it was at that point that he was abducted. And I'll tell you how it went down. But just to preface this, I had listened to this story before because this was coming from Richard Doty, who was doing an episode on Gaia, and he was like telling about how this ball of light came into the weapons area. It didn't like come in from a door. It just appeared in the air out of nowhere, and it took him. And I thought to myself, why would they take just a weapons technician? But you got to remember, this wasn't just any weapons technician. This was a lieutenant. Lieutenants have, they have rank. Okay, they're not a colonel, they're not a major, but they have rank. They're an officer. So it would make sense if they wanted to take somebody, not to take just like, a private or, a sergeant, even though sergeants are NCOs, they're non-commissioned officers, but to take somebody that had some rank and to interview them or whatever they were going to do, right? So that's exactly what happens. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. So I'll give you a little bit of background here. So they worked on the air rockets at this facility. They called them Genies. They contained a W-25 warhead with a 1.7 kiloton yield. And Anderson was abducted on August 11th, 1970, dude. 1970. That's a long time ago. Long time ago. 54, 55 years now? I mean, Jesus. So they were in the maintenance area where they bring the nuclear weapons, they perform their maintenance on them because they have to do maintenance on these things. They have limited life components that are built into these things. So they have to change them out every so often, and they prepare them for, the pre-flight operations as well. Well, that's exactly when he got abducted, was when they were starting to work on the maintenance of these things. So they took him back to the storage area. They had to go through maintenance and be checked to make sure they weren't armed. And they go back. And there's four technicians that are working on this thing with the lieutenant. And this is exactly when he's abducted. He goes right up through the wall and disappears. So the technicians are immediately freaking out. They're like, holy shit. They notify the next commander in the chain of command, who was a captain. And the captain responded. And the technicians basically told him, hey, dude, our lieutenant was standing right over there, and like a bolt of lightning came down, and he's just not here anymore. So imagine being the captain and getting that kind of information. You'd be like, these guys are cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. But the fact of the matter is that they were in this area that resembled an igloo, and there was no way to get in or out except through one door. So they only had one door entrance to this place. So he didn't go out the door. He would have been seen by not only the technicians but also by other people in the base. So they check everywhere. They check the storage area. They check all over the base. They figured he's got to be somewhere. Then they brought in the Office of Special Investigations of the Air Force to check on these guys and see what was going on. And these guys are, clearly freaked out. They're young technicians. They're in their 20s usually. Sometimes they're under 20 years old. Even. So these guys are this might be their first job ever. They might just get out of technician school and this is like their first gig. And meanwhile, they have their boss disappear on them because of a ball of light. Could you imagine then just coming out of the 1960s and out of the, hippie era and all of a sudden, well, that's not even a hippie era just yet. Well, it's kind of around the same time. And you're listening to Jimi Hendrix and all of a sudden a fucking ball of lightning just comes out of nowhere and takes your boss. Well, anyway, let's get to the good shit, right? Let's get down to it. So let's get to the abduction. So what happened in the abduction, right? So basically, he comes back 5 years later onto the base, and he's within the walls of the base. So he's not like outside of the base. He's within the walls of the base, and a security forces member, raises his rifle to him. He's like, he sees him, and he's looking at his security badge, and his security badge is out of date. It's like an old looking. They had updated their badge. So, like to be inside this particular base, you had to have like a badge, not just like your ranks and everything, but in all your ribbons. But you had to have a badge. And so he raises his rifle. He's like, "Where are you coming from?" He's like, he couldn't even answer. He couldn't even talk. Couldn't talk at all. They brought him into the medical bay, got him some, assistance, warmed him up and everything. And after I think they said a few hours, he was able to start talking, and he couldn't talk at all. But finally, he starts to tell the tale of him being abducted. And what he says is truly terrifying. So let's check this out. So what he says is he's taken up into, he initially, when it first started, he was taken up into a round container. And then he was placed onto a table, like a triangular table even, interestingly enough. And he was surrounded by grays. He called them humanoids. He said they weren't any more than 4.5 to 5 feet tall. They had large heads. They didn't have any ears, slit for mouth, slit for nose, large eyes. So kind of your typical gray, except they're 4.5 to 5 feet tall and not like 3 feet tall. But they had insanely long arms, which came down to like past their kneecaps, which is kind of interesting. So it's almost like they were biologically developed that way. And he's surrounded by these grays, and it's not just a few grays. I mean, he's talking about the fact that these guys were on top of different levels within this room. So there's like, it's kind of like a multi-structured, multi-leveled room with different platforms on it. And these grays are on top of these platforms looking down at him. And then there's floor level grays. He said in the artistry here, it looks like they have about like 20 different grays in the room. And they examined him from head to toe. They were spending an extremely long time examining him, poking him with instruments, putting things, into his eyes, a gadget that went into his nose. He had multiple gadgets that went into his nose, but he never felt any pain, interestingly enough, until he felt like a pain in his foot. And he realized that they had taken a toenail out of his foot, interestingly enough. There's no blood, though. And then he felt dizzy again, and he found himself in a chair. And this was a metal chair with a big brace over his arms and chest, so he couldn't move at all. And he was looking all around, and he sees all these humanoids all around him. I mean, they're just surrounding him, and they weren't talking to him in a verbal voice. They were talking to him through telepathy, and they started asking him questions about what his job was, and they kept talking to him and asking questions about his exact position. And he's like, "What are you talking about? What are you talking about?" And they understood him, and they continued to respond via telepathy, and they kept asking questions. They said, what are these metal containers that you're working on? These destructive metal containers that you work on and create. And he realized, oh, they're talking about the nuclear weapons that we make. And he asked them, "Are you talking about our nuclear weapons?" And at first they didn't even understand what he said, but eventually they got the grasp. So it's interesting they didn't understand the fact that he's saying nuclear weapons, but they're using kind of like standard metal containers as their method of communication about these nuclear weapons. Kind of interesting. But finally, they kept asking questions. He said, "I'm not answering any more questions. I can't talk about that. It's classified. I don't know who you are, and I'm not saying anything else." But he was stuck in this chair. He wasn't going to get let go. They weren't going to let him go. So they put a big metal cylinder over his head. It came down over his head, kind of like an MRI machine, and he went blind. And he started feeling like these weird pulses, these strange lights started to appear in his mind, and kind of like all these strange, sensations started to go around his head and his eyes. And this thing lifted up and took off, came off of him, and he was having these illusions, he was calling them. And you could see things, but he couldn't see things at the same time. And they took this metal container off him, and he realized he was being, his brain was being scanned for the information they required. So he realized they were reading his mind, trying to get information. He said he wasn't going to speak. Okay, we're going to scan your mind. And so he realized that he's in trouble. These guys are from another planet. They have high technology. They took him to another room, and it was another humongous, like kind of a ballroom almost, with multi-platforms on it, humanoids everywhere, aliens, like an amphitheater, basically, he says. They were looking down on him, and one alien came up to him that didn't look like the others. It had a nearly human face with a nose, eyes, ears, and a mouth, and it started to look at him. And he came in front of him, and he noticed that its hands were the fingers on this particular alien's hands were similar to the other alien's hands. However, the arms didn't go down as nearly as long as the other ones did. So this alien starts to ask him questions, and the lieutenant's saying, "I'm not going to answer your questions." And finally, the alien says, "How do you make these destructive devices? Why do you make these destructive devices?" And the alien says, "You can no longer deceive us anymore." That's terrifying. It says, "You cannot deceive us anymore. You cannot deceive us anymore." So he figures he has no choice but to tell them what's going on and everything that they wanted to know. So he did. And after he tells them, the humanoids, they're looking at him, and they're sitting in this whole amphitheater. After he tells them, they disappear. Most of them disappear. And he's looking at them like, what the hell? Like almost like they've been beamed out with like technology, just transported. All of a sudden, he starts feeling like he's floating in the air. He's floating in the air above this table, and he's kind of like rolling and getting a little bit dizzy. And they sit him back down on the table. He couldn't figure out if he was like inside of something or if he was being moved around, because then he went to sleep. And he woke up inside of the weapons storage area 5 years later. He says he figured out when he woke up he was dazed. He couldn't focus his eyes very well at all. It took him some time to focus his eyes, and he remembers the security officer was talking to him, and he was trying to respond, but he couldn't. He just couldn't get anything out of his mouth, basically. And he was telling him, "Hey, the security officer's like, 'What are you doing here? Who are you?' Da 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 da." And so they brought him in, and they started to, interrogate him. And one of the guys that was there that night, one of the technicians that was actually there, was still working at that base when this Lieutenant Gary, comes back, and he sees him, and he's like he sees a ghost. He can't believe what he's seeing in front of his eyes. He's like, "Holy shit, that's Lieutenant Gary. He's back. He's been gone for 5 years. He disappeared." and they bring Gary into the medical office. And the medical offices have calendars on them that have the previous month, the current month, and the other and the future month on it. Now, what's crazy about this is that he looks at it and he sees it says 1975. He was taken in 1970. He said it can't be 75. He said it's 1970. And he started to like freak out because he's like, I got to be in a dream. It can't be 1975. There's no way. And so these guys, they just, they're trying to calm him down. They're trying to say, it's okay, relax. He's like, I don't know how I got out in the field. He said, last thing I know, I was working on, our nuclear device. And next thing I know, I'm sitting out in this field. So they send in the Office of Special Investigations. They investigate him. They ask him tons of questions, and they kind of get him to, kind of an understanding. But he was so upset that they actually sent this guy out to, basically a mental health hospital. They determined that he couldn't, work in this field any longer. That he's been gone for 5 years. That he needs help, but they didn't know how to help him, so they sent him off to a mental health hospital, basically to live for a while. And then they notified his parents that he was back. They actually reached out to them and said, "Hey, your son's back." They never called them to say, "Hey, your son's dead" or anything like that, or he's missing. They just said, he's on a mission, da 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 da. So they gave him that medical discharge. His parents were able to see him, but they sent him to Texas. So he was up in Washington. They sent him to Texas. Well, geez Louise. So he was there for like 4 or 5 months, from what they say. He went through a psychological evaluation, and that's when they realized, he couldn't remain in the Air Force. He was medically discharged, and they sent him to the medical hospital. But that's like what's so sad is that, like, not only does this guy lose 5 years, but he loses his whole life now because, how do you can't support yourself if you can't work. And, do they give him medical compensation? Do they give him, financial compensation? They should be giving this guy a house to live in for the rest of his life. I mean, he sacrificed his life for the country, and I bet you, I don't know. They don't say in this episode, whether or not they took care of him, the way they should. But man, I can't imagine being that guy or being part of his family and like having him come back and, the government not taking care of him. But he was medically discharged. He got psychological care. I'm sure he got, medical stuff taken care of through the Veterans Administration. And that's what they talk about here. But they were also concerned that this guy was a potential security leak. They go out, he's not medically or mentally stable. Is he going to be a security problem? Is he going to go out and talk about it? That these guys are monitoring his phones. These guys are monitoring, basically like his every movement, making sure he's not going to go out and blab to everybody. But they would come and talk to him at his home. They would come and talk to him at the hospital. He had to fill out a form if he was ever going to move, and send it into the Air Force. So basically, he was like this whole, security risk. But eventually, he ends up buying a car dealership, and owns a car dealership for a while. So that's good. But he did pass away. So he's gone now, so we can't ask him any more questions. But Doty was able to interview him before he passed and gather up all this information, and it was a whole big to do, within the intelligence community. Where did he go? Was he actually gone for 5 years? Was he put into a suspended animation for 5 years? When the lieutenant was talking about being in a cylinder and just like tumbling around after he gave the aliens their interview and their answers. Why didn't they just kept him, and did they travel the galaxy and go pick up other people and try to find out information? Why wasn't he immediately returned? That would be my question. Were they hanging on to him for a bargaining chip? were they hanging on to him because he was part of something that was too dangerous, and they thought, well, if we keep him, then he's not, the humans won't continue this project. Well, obviously they did. He got sent back, and we still working with nukes. But what happened to him? Even he doesn't know. I wonder if they, if it sounds like they never did hypnotic regression, but if they could have done that, maybe they could have found out some answers. So anyway, that's kind of the story. It's a sad story, but it's an interesting story at the same time. It's one that I've never really heard of before. And the sad thing is, like, even now that they talk about the fact that when he eventually lived on his own, he strapped himself down with a metal bar on his bed to prevent being taken again. I mean, that's how damaged and PTSD ridden individuals can be from these events, man. They're so traumatic. Strapped himself into a bed with multiple different straps. He came up with different straps to be better and better and better, but something that he could work with. But his personal life was totally ruined. I mean, I can't imagine. So anyway, hopefully none of us have to deal with that, because that'd be traumatic and nearly impossible to come back from. So anyway, I'll continue to bring you guys the most pertinent, interesting stories, ones you'll hear nowhere else, right here on Lockdown Universe. Please like, follow, share, subscribe. I still got to put some more videos over on YouTube. Seems like TikTok is going to be going the way of the dodo bird, at least in America. So, Spotify, I don't know, they're just not monetizing as much. So, I'd like to try to help build the brand, right, and to help promote it on YouTube. So, look out there. I'll be posting some more videos there as well. All right, guys, take care of yourselves. Stay positive. Stay true to yourself. Take care of your friends, families, and loved ones. Follow through on your hobbies and your goals and your dreams. Take care of yourselves physically, spiritually, emotionally, and as always, continue to question the universe around you. Until next time, take care. Lockdown Universe out.